Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bible by the Week. We are in week 9. Congratulations for continuing to work through the scriptures with me through some of the more difficult, but in some ways interesting passages. This week in week 9, we are dealing with Numbers, chapters 3 through 19, and we're going to do our first foray into one of the Psalms. So I am in the kitchen, as you can tell, a commercial kitchen here in McCall, because I wanted to talk about purification and purity, which is a big issue in the Old Testament, in this time when God is trying to take these slaves out of Egypt and turn them into a holy nation. And you might know that it wasn't that long ago that what was called germ theory was extremely controversial, that there are these invisible things called germs that if they get into your body or if they get into your food, they can make you sick and maybe even kill you. And of course, now we take that for granted, and the health department has all sorts of regulations if you're going to have a commercial kitchen about how things need to be washed and sanitized. And so we're fully equipped here, but not so even 100 years ago or 200 years ago for sure. And we talk about that, we take that for granted, but we don't talk much about the purity of spiritual things. In fact, pretty much we're in an age where anything goes and everyone's religion is all the same, and whatever you think is right, and whatever you think is wrong, well, that's your opinion. And this is kind of takes us back to the atmosphere that God was dealing with in ancient times when, as it says in the Judges that we'll get to soon, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And yet there were consequences. And so God is trying to teach the people of Israel about the consequences of spiritual problems, spiritual impurity, spiritual rebellion, especially in the stories that we had this week. So let's get into some of how God taught the children of Israel about this. Now, when we get into Numbers chapter 3, you find out that Aaron, the one Moses' younger brother, whom has been appointed to be the priest over Israel, he has 4 sons, but 2 of his sons, it goes to their heads. They are infected with egotism, and so it goes to their head, and they offer unauthorized fire. And you think, well, that's not a big deal. Well, yes, it is, because fire was the means of purification before a holy God, and their motives were evil. Their motives were to take matters into their own hands rather than being subject or submissive to God, and so they're struck down by this fire. However, we note that the entire tribe of Levi, because of their zeal for God, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai and so on, and they are set aside as being a holy tribe. Out of the 13 tribes, they are set aside. So that's why we get only 12 tribes, including Joseph's sons. And they are going to serve in the tabernacle, this tent of meeting where God will live in the midst of his people. And in the second chapter, we find out that each of the 3 tribes within Levi, each of the 3 family groups, has a different requirement, responsibility when it comes to moving the tabernacle and caring for its materials. But I also want to point out that the tribe of Levi is the tribe that serves in the place of the firstborn male of all the other tribes, which is interesting. So they clearly are to represent all the other tribes. And the firstborn male was the male who had the most responsibility in the family, was to carry on the future line. And that's the role that Levi would play among the tribes of Israel. So God, again, in chapter 5, emphasizes physical purity, but also social restitution, that when people do wrong, they have to make up for it. And there's an interesting passage in here, controversial, where if a man, if he suspects that his wife has been cheating on him, has been unfaithful to him, there is a means by which the priests are supposed to determine whether she's actually guilty or not, because it's going to be she said against he said, and women were in a great disadvantage to men in patriarchal society. And this was by means of concocting a brew and having her drink it. And if she miscarries the child, then she is considered to be guilty. And if, on the other hand, she is able to maintain the pregnancy, or nothing happens to her womb and she continues to be able to have children, then her name is cleared and she's been falsely accused by her husband. This seems really barbaric today, but then again, we have abortion in our society today and around the world, which is a similar way that people deal with consequences. The difference is now it's the woman's choice, and there's no real role for the husband. And this is controversial because there's some that claim that this brew that the priests would give this woman, and it was a very public thing, that this was a form of abortion because it would cause the child to miscarry. But it really, out in the desert, these primitive people, what other way did a woman have to clear her name? Because if she's innocent, there's no evidence that proves she's innocent. The husband is still going to be jealous. He's still going to be suspicious. So we don't know all the ins and outs of how it worked, but we do trust that this was God's way of allowing women to prove their innocence when otherwise they couldn't, and they were at a great disadvantage to their husbands. Now, the 6th chapter has a famous vow called a Nazirite vow. And this was a vow that people could take in order to set themselves apart, generally just for a time. And notice this was for both men and women. They would make a vow to the Lord, and there were certain restrictions. They couldn't have any of the fruit of the vine, that is of grapes and so on. And they would shave their hair at the end of this vow, but as long as they were under the vow, they were to keep their hair long. And famously, later on, we're going to hear about one of the judges, Samson, who from birth was a Nazirite his whole life. And so his hair wasn't to be cut, or he would have violated his vow. He wasn't to have touched unclean animals, and yet Samson fails in that vow. But this is the origin of that idea of the Nazirite. In this same chapter, Aaron is given the Aaronic benediction, or the benediction given to Aaron, on which God's name is put onto his people. And we still use that today. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. This idea of God's face shining on you is easy to understand. When you have someone's favor, then their face shines on you, right? They smile. And that's what God's people wanted, was God to smile on them and to give them peace, that they didn't have to worry. And so a lot of these regulations and so on were intended to create peace among the community of Israel and peace between them and God. Now, the tabernacle is consecrated in chapter 7 of Numbers. You notice there are 12 offerings over the course of 12 days, and they're listed in detail according to the 12 tribes that gave them. It's kind of like a lot of organizations have some kind of plaque on the wall or some kind of record keeping of who donated to the institution, the creation of the institution. And this was the case in the book of Numbers. It's not just numbers of people, it's numbers of offerings and just all this record keeping, the original administration in the church. And you notice that in this giving to the Lord, unlike today, your offerings to the Lord were public. They were not private. Just like, this ritual for a woman, it was not considered to be a private thing. If people were having an affair in Israel, that was a blemish. That was something impure in Israel. If they were not obeying any of God's laws, it affected the whole community. And the same was true when people gave their offerings. It was a very public thing. It was a show of their allegiance, their devotion to the Lord. And so the lamps are set up in the tabernacle. The Levites are consecrated for their service there. Israel celebrates their first Passover remembrance. And the last week we had the story of how Passover was to be observed and all of the requirements for that. I noticed that there's provision made for those who are unclean. Say you've touched a dead body or something like that, so that they can celebrate at a different time. There are provisions for the aliens among them to celebrate the Passover and people who are traveling. So no one is to be left out from the Passover celebration. And when they celebrate this, God's cloud descends over the tabernacle, and that cloud would direct Israel. When they were to break camp, the cloud would arise and they would break camp and follow the cloud. And then when it stopped, they would set up camp underneath the cloud of God's glory. There are silver trumpets that are made, maybe not trumpets the way we think of them, not with valves or anything like that, but they're made out of silver, so they're even more resonant than what are typically called horns in the Bible, which are made of animal horns, and which is, by the way, where the word comes from, is the horns on the animal are the horns that we blow. But these are special, and they're used for signaling the camp as to when they are to move out. They will also be used in battle to signal people. They didn't have walkie-talkies or anything like that. So Israel leaves the Sinai desert for Paran, and they have a scout that they send out ahead. But people complain about the hardships, and God burns with anger. He has just shown them what a holy God he is, and created this giant object lesson in the form of the tabernacle, and yet they complain against the holy God. And so God burns with anger, and Moses prays for Israel, and God's anger dies down. And in fact, this is a famous story. The rabble among them, it says, craves meat because God has provided manna for them, but now they want meat, protein. And the people are wailing, and Moses is, more than rolling his eyes, but you can hear him say, just kill me now, just kill me now. Why did you bring me out of Egypt to be head of these terrible people? And so what God does for Moses is he puts his spirit on 70 of the elders of Israel. And this is a famous story because 2 of the elders stay in the camp. They don't get to the tent of meeting. Unsure whether it's intentional, what the deal was, but God puts his spirit on them too. And Joshua gets upset by this. He's, in effect saying, Moses, these guys didn't obey the rules and God gave them his spirit. Do you want me to go do something? And Moses' answer is, no, I wish God's spirit were on everyone in Israel. And of course, God is going to fulfill this on the day of Pentecost, when famously the prediction of Joel comes through that God's spirit is on all of his people, men and women, old and young. But for the time being, it's just the 70 elders, and they're going to share leadership with Moses. And this is so that Moses doesn't have to bear all of this burden. And God, in addition, tells Moses, okay, you want meat? I'll give you meat. They're going to have so much meat, it's going to be coming out of their noses real soon. And sure enough, God has this flock of quail that come, and they just have to, you can't literally swing a stick without hitting a quail. And they have so much meat, they just ultimately don't know what to do with it. God just gorges them with meat. But then as a response to that, they also get a plague for their complaining. So God is both demonstrating that he has the power to fulfill their needs and demonstrating that he will not put up with their complaining, because he is a holy God and they are privileged to have him bless them in the ways that he's blessed them. And this is the lesson over and over again that Israel struggles to master, and it's everyone in Israel. You get to the next chapter, and it's Aaron and Miriam, Moses' older sister and younger brother, and they are jealous of Moses, so they start slandering Zipporah, Moses' wife, because she's a Cushite, and so Miriam is struck with leprosy, and Moses, similar to the way that Job had to pray for his friends to heal them and for their forgiveness, Moses has to pray for Miriam, and then her leprosy goes away. So we get to this pivotal story. It only takes a couple of months, really, by foot to travel from Egypt to the borders of the Promised Land. And of course, they've camped out at the base of Mount Sinai, but now they've moved out. They're at the border of the Promised Land. And so God has them select one man from each of the 12 tribes to be a spy, to sneak into the Promised Land and see what kind of land it is. And these 12 spies go into Canaan to spy it out, and they come back with this report about it is a land flowing with milk and honey. Not literally, but meaning that there's lots of grazing for milk cows and goats, that there is honey, rich woodlands, that there are grapes, and they bring back pomegranates and samples of the produce. And so Caleb, one of the two spies, and Joshua, they say, let's go take it. We can do this. God just took us out of Egypt, conquered the greatest military power on earth. We can do this. Let's do it. And the other 10 spies say, oh, but the people there, they're so big. We just look like grasshoppers next to them. After 400 years of slavery and malnutrition, without a doubt, the people of Israel were a smaller people, and they weren't in great physical condition. But that was the point, that God was going to give them the land of Canaan, that they weren't going to have to fight for it themselves. But what they needed to have faith in God. And this is the very thing that they lacked. And so when we talk about the 40 years the Israelites wandered in the desert, it's not because they were lost and they didn't know where they were. It's because God told them that because of their lack of faith, they weren't ready to enter into the Promised Land and take on these armies, and that they would have to wait until a whole generation dies off. And biblically, a generation is 40 years, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. They will be the only two of those spies who will survive to enter Canaan, actually under the leadership of Joshua. And the other spies, aren't going to make it. And in fact, the people say, oh, no, that's terrible. We can't do that. We can't wait another 40 years. So without God's blessing, they go up and they try to conquer the army at the border of the Promised Land. And of course, they're beaten back. They lose the battle without God. And, they're rebelling against God. And so, they lose this battle. God is threatening to destroy them and start all over again. This time, it was Moses who'd had enough with them. It's again God who has enough to them. And this time Moses stands up for the people. He says, God, you can't do that because all of the nations are watching what you're doing. And you've raised up this people in order to show that you are the great God over all of heaven and earth, that you can reverse fortunes, that you are in control of everything. So if these people get wiped out in the desert, all the people of the nations of the earth will think that you're untrustworthy, that you go back on your promises. And so, it's interesting that now Moses has taken God's position and praying for the people to be saved, for God to relent. And so God does forgive the people. Moses has argued that God is abounding in love, slow to anger, forgiving sins and rebellion. And this is one of the things we do when we pray to God. We remind him of his promises and his character. We don't pray to God making a negotiation with him. God, if you do this, I'll do this for you. We have nothing with which to negotiate. We pray to God and ask him to remember his promises and to remember his character and to be good to us, not because we're good, but because he's a good God and because he doesn't treat us the way that our sins deserve. So, God does forgive them, but he also imposes a natural consequence on them. This 40 years that they're going to wander in the desert, the spies, the faithless ones die. The people try to enter the promised land and they're beaten back. God tells them, nonetheless, you will enter the promised land. When you do, add oil and wine to your grain offerings. This is a way of saying you're definitely going to inherit this land. It's going to be better than just this grain that you've got out here in the desert. You're also going to have olive oil from olive trees and wine from vineyards. Two of the things that to this day in the Mediterranean are the most highly prized of foods. So he he provides atonement offerings in case people make unintentional sins, and orders that intentional rebels that they be exiled. They can't be with the people of Israel because the whole nation gets infected by people with a bad attitude, with a lack of faith. This is what I mean by spiritual purity being so essential for God's people. And in fact, those who intentionally break the Sabbath, this day that God has blessed them with, a day of rest and worship of God, that person needs to be killed. God takes his holiness seriously, and the people need to take his holiness seriously also. There's also a regulation in here that's interesting. It's still observed by some Orthodox Jews to this day, and that is that their prayer shawls will have tassels on them, which will set those clothes apart and set the people of Israel apart from other nations by this fashion accessory. They are to be the unique people of God. I just want to take a break here because then you got to read Psalm 90, which is the oldest psalm, it's thought, attributed to Moses traditionally, because other than the prophets, it's the one prayer that God would relent, and it's a prayer on behalf of God's people. It's a famous psalm. I've had people include it in their funeral service. Lord, you have been our dwelling place through all generations. It includes that line, 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just passed by. And then why funerals? Because it says you sweep men away in the sleep of death. We are consumed by your anger. Teach us to number our days aright. Have compassion on your servants, because you know that we're temporary. Satisfy us with your unfailing love and establish the work of our hands, which is what the people are hoping will happen when they enter into Canaan. So that's why this psalm was pulled out there, because it is traditionally attributed to Moses, and it very much matches what he may have been praying for the people of Israel. So we pick up in Numbers with chapter 16, another famous story. Maybe not famous to our age, but it was very famous to the Israelites. One of the Levites, and the Levites had been set aside with this special privilege and responsibility of taking care of the tabernacle furnishings and supporting the priests. But one of them leads a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. He says, if we're a holy nation, then we're all equally as good. And everybody should have the same responsibility. We should, in effect, he's arguing for democracy, that we should all have the same privileges. But God hasn't called Israel to a democracy. He's called them to a theocracy, to rule by God. And so they have this showdown. And initially, God is going to wipe out all the people again. Moses says, no, just the leader of this rebellion, a guy named Korah, and two others who have backed him up. And so Moses and Aaron have everyone move away from Korah and his tents and his family, and from these other two. And you say, well, that's not fair, because it actually says that there are innocents among them. No, it doesn't. It says that there are little ones, right? And very often what you have, especially in communal, generational cultures like this, is that if you strike down just the head of the family in one generation, because it's an honor culture, those children and grandchildren will feel that they need to take vengeance on whoever did that to their father or grandfather on behalf of the family. And generally, because people lived in tents and they lived in close quarters, you couldn't get away with rebelling against God unless your family supported you. So they weren't innocent, and they were going to be a problem. And it's a communal culture where your children, it's clearly seen more than people believe it's true in our culture. Your children are part of your leadership. They're your responsibility, and the way that you lead them is the way that they are going to go. And so the ground swallows up Korah and his family and the other two guys and their families. It's a clear sign to Israel that they and their whole families are responsible to each other for not rebelling against the people that God has put in place, not thinking that they can take matters into their own hands, or that they somehow are entitled to have an equal vote in the way that things go. This nation has been raised up by God himself, and it's God who will be their leader. A similar incident happens after this when some of the others argue that there's no reason that Aaron should just be the priest, and so God has each tribe select a staff, and they lay it in the place of meeting in the tabernacle overnight. And Aaron's staff, by the next morning, has not only sprouted, but it's actually grown almonds. And this makes it clear to people without sincere loss of life that Aaron is the one God has selected as the high priest over Israel, and it's God's doing. In addition to that, there's like 250 people who have taken the censers that were made for the tabernacle, and by censers we mean these metal brass things that incense would be burned in, and that you could would be on a chain. And they've offered fire to God, and Aaron has offered incense to God, and fire comes down from God and consumes the 250 who took it upon themselves. You would think that they would have learned from Aaron's own sons that you don't offer fire to God unless God calls you specifically to do it, but they hadn't learned that. Israel again and again struggles with this, just as we do. We have this sense of entitlement before God where we say, hey, I'm a good person. Why would God thinks that he should rule over me? I should be my own God. I should tell God what I believe and what's good. And, it's the same thing that's been going on since Adam and Eve chose good and evil for themselves. And Israel just continues to struggle with this. Anyway, at the end, God instructs Moses to take Aaron's staff and place it in the Ark of the Covenant, which is this big box and the most holy place in the tabernacle that contains the stone tablets with God's law inscribed on it. And it contains a jar of manna to show God's provision. And now it will also contain this staff of Aaron's that has budded into almonds to show that God has also provided the priesthood in order to cover over the sin and the impurity of his people, to enable God to live with them. So if you're ever wondering, that final scene in Indiana Jones and the Crusaders of the Lost Ark, if you're ever wondering, what you would have seen if you opened up the Ark of the Covenant, it probably, wasn't the seraphim or the cherubim that had been trapped inside coming out to kill all the Nazis. If it had been preserved, it would have been the stone tablets and Aaron's staff and the jar of manna. That's what's described in the scripture. That's where we're going to leave it for today. I hope that you're enjoying this read through the Bible. As Luther said, if you get to a point that you don't understand or that seems tedious, just praise God and skip ahead. But thanks for joining me for this summary. The Lord be with you.